Today's daf is daf Chaf Aleph. We'll begin where we left off yesterday on Chaf Amud Beis Meimar. So that's a few lines before the end of the Amud. 3 lines up. Meimar Shachid Le Bar Brei. He lost a grandson, his son's son. And Kara Ilu, he actually cut Kriya over his grandson. And this is what we would call in Hebrew his dahut. It's sort of he commensurates with his son, who is now a real Ovel, and we call it, perhaps we could call it an empathetic kriya. Now, this he did before his son was in his Daled Amos, but also Bray, his son now showed up, and they're together in the same place. Kara Biape, he cuts his garment a second time in the presence of his son, because I guess he felt that the first kriya was not enough of an identification with the avelus of his son. But now that his son is present, in the presence of his son, he tears a second kriya. Then Idkar, all of a sudden, he, so to speak, bangs himself on the head and realizes the Miyushav Kara, that the 2 kriyos that he did were both while he was sitting. And the halachas was soon derived, requires that we stand for kriya. Come, so now he stands up, Kara Ma'umad, and he does kriya in a standing position for the 3rd time. Amalei Rav Ashi Lamemu. So Rav Ashi apparently heard about this story, and especially focusing attention on the requirement of a Meimar to stand for Kriya Demumad Minolim. From whence do we derive that Kriya has to be done in a standing position? The Gemara is going to go through now a few options and reject them. The first option is Vayakam Eov Vayikra Es Me'ilo. When Eov finds out about the loss of his children, he stands up and he rips his cloak. Now it says Vayakam. Right? We don't know exactly what the word Vayakam means. You know, if it would have said Vayamod, that's one thing. But Vayakam might mean that he stood up and did something. Meaning not physically stood up, but he energized himself and made that decision. Now we start Daf Chaf Aleph. Ata, if you're correct, asks Rav Ashi, that whenever it says that he stood up, that means that we're required to do so. And the Tanakh is not just telling us some sort of a story about what happened. Then what do we do with the following pasuk? It says, V'amad v'amar lo chafatzti l'kach, in the parsha of Chalitza in Kitetze, when the Yavam is obligated to recite a certain nusach, a certain presentation, does he have to do so in a standing position? The Amad? No, there's maybe Amida itself, like the way we interpret Vayakam, means he stood, he went for it, he energized himself, he implemented. But it doesn't mean that he actually physically stood up. Because Hachinami, if you're going to tell me that whenever it says that in the Tanakh, V'yamad or V'yakam, it means you're required to do so. But Tanya, we learned in the Brisa regarding the mitzvah of Chalitza, Ben Yoshev, Ben Omed, Ben Muta, that you can implement Chalitza no matter whether you're sitting, whether you're standing, whether you're leaning. So we see that when the word V'yamad is used by the Torah, it doesn't necessarily mean that he stood up in order to fulfill the halachic requirements of that mitzvah. But rather it means that he took the initiative. As we said before, he energized himself. And if that be the case, then when we go back to Eov, and there it says, Vayakam, Vayikras Me'ilo, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was required to do so. It means that he was energized to do so. Amalei, So a memar tries to defend himself. In the case of chalitza loktiv, v'ya'amod v'omar, meaning he's required to stand and recite the parak. But hachaksiv vayakom vayikra. And the word vayakom, according to a memar, means that he was required to do so. And the Gemara now quotes Rami Bar Chama, who derives the requirement of Amida for Kriya from the same pasuk in Iyov. B'nayin l'kriya she'ima umad, shenemar vayakam Iyov vayikra. So now the Gemara wants to know, okay, maybe you're correct that Iyov ripped his garment in the context of Avelus, meaning when he found out of his tragic loss. But Dilma Bilsi, you say, maybe he went beyond the law, beyond the letter of the law. This was not required. This was already Iyov working beyond the law, standing up, as it were, to indicate to what extent he felt the tragedy. If you're not going to agree that what Iyov did in the context of Avelus was beyond the letter of the law, then what are you going to do with the pasuk in Iyov that says Vayagas es rotu, he tore the hair out of his head? Now you're going to tell me that this is a halachic requirement? On the contrary, it might even be prohibited. So you can't say that whatever we see in Iyov, even if he did it in the context of Avelus, that we could derive from that it's a requirement. Iyov added and enhanced, expanded the kiyum of Niyag Avelus beyond the letter of the law. So to say that, therefore, if Iyov stood for Kriya, we have to imitate Iyov and derive from Iyov that this is a requirement, that's not so, because then you're going to come to the absurd and untenable position that we're required to rip the hair out of our head. So at this point, the Gemara leaves Iyov out of the picture and picks up David HaMelech. When David found out about the loss of his son, which was who was murdered by Avshalom. Again, initially he thought that Avshalom had murdered all of his children, but anyway, at that point, it says, "Vayakom Amelech Vayikras B'Gadav," and again that word Vayakom, indicating that this is the requirement of Kriya, that Kriya has to be done be'amida. So once again, the Gemara is going to argue against this same logic. Dilma Milsi, you say, Rasav, and maybe David HaMelech went beyond the law, beyond the requirements of Hilchas Avelus and Kiyum Kriya. And I'll prove to you, says the Gemara, that certainly David HaMelech in his expression of Avelus went beyond the law. Dilo Temach, if you don't agree with me, it says about David HaMelech, Vayishkav Arza, that he laid down on the ground. You're going to tell me that we're required to lie down on the ground. That's not so. The halacha requires what's called kfiyas hamita, that the Avel sleep on the bed that he turns over. And some of the Rishonim say this doesn't apply to us today because in those days, when you would turn over the bed, there were posts on the side of the bed you could actually put down like a mattress and sleep on it. But today it's not comfortable. We don't require kfiyas hamita. But to sleep on the ground, Tanya, we have the opposite conclusion based on a brisa that Yachan al gabi mida al gabi kitza al gabi odioni gedola or al gabi karka lo yotzi de chavasa. So let's say he did not implement kfiyas hamita by turning his bed upside down. Instead, what he did was he slept on a chair or on a bed, or al gabi odioni. Odioni is also a kind of like mattress that you put on the ground. So in other words, now we're talking about a person who instead of sleeping on an overturned bed, he falls asleep on a chair or on a bed and he takes off the mattress, or a mattress is on the ground, or he sleeps directly on the ground. In none of these cases, no matter how uncomfortable it might be in the way he slept, it's not a fulfillment of the mitzvah of kfiyas hamita of an oven. And on this list, we see that sleeping on the ground is not a kiyum of kfiyas hamita. The Omer Rabbi Yochanan shlo kiyem kfiyas hamita. And in all these cases, the mattresses and with the chairs that he slept in, or the fact that he slept on the ground itself, none of this is a fulfillment to the requirement of kfiyas hamita. So we must conclude that David HaMelech went beyond the letter of the law. He wanted to indicate how tragic it was for him to have lost his son, and he slept on the floor. Again, the post can point out that he slept on a mita kfuya to fulfill the law of Avelus, and then he would climb off the bed, the overturned bed, and he would lie on the floor. But nevertheless, we see clearly that David HaMelech went beyond the requirement of the law, and he expressed and manifested Avelus in the most severe and profound way. So therefore, you cannot prove the fact that David HaMelech stood up, Vayakom HaMelech, and then Vayikras B'Kodim, that's required according to the din. So at this point, we're still stuck. We don't have a source for the requirement of standing, as Hamema requires it, but for Kriya. Amalei, so the Gemara says, Ke'ein art. So the Gemara doesn't, the Pasuk doesn't mean to say that Vayishkav Artza, that he actually slept on the ground. Vayishkav Artza, he was like so uncomfortable because he turned over his bed to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Kfiyas Hamita, that it was as if he had lied on the floor. That's how uncomfortable it was. But once again, you have no proof here that David HaMelech went beyond the law, the letter of the law in his Kiyum Avelis. Therefore, when it says Vayakam Vayikra, we should derive the conclusion that you're required to stand for a bid. And that seems to be the final conclusion of this. We have a list in this brisa of those activities that a mourner is enjoined from involving himself in asim malach. And as we go along through the sugi, we'll see that the isur malach is not identical with the isur malach of a Shabbos or a Yontif. There's going to be a partial isur malach for a chitza also. There might be different cases which are exceptions to the rule, and we allow him to wash part of his body, or maybe in cold water. Sicha, anointing himself, tashamita, intercourse, me'ilas hasandal. He's not allowed to put on his shoes. He also likros b'torah b'neviyim ksuvim. He's not allowed to read any parts of Tanakh. L'shanos b'mishnah to learn Mishnah, which is already Torah Shval Peh, Medrash, Halachas, Shas, Agados. Now, with regard to Agados, there may be parts of the Agadah that he's allowed to learn. And even parts of Halacha that it's allowed. An Ovel is allowed to learn Hilchas Avelus. He's allowed to study sad parts of the Agadah. And even in Tanakh itself, he's allowed to study Eov, Kinos, which is Eicha, and certain Dvarim Haroim Shebiyirmiyah, parts of the book of Jeremiah that are very sad. Now, are there situations in which we could allow the Avel to study Torah? And the answer is if he's teaching Torah. And not only teaching Torah, but he's teaching Torah to the Rabbah. Im Hayu Rabbah Tzrichim Lo, he's the Rebbe. The Rama depends on him to transmit the Torah, and he now is an Avel. Eino Nimna, he should not separate himself from teaching Torah publicly. Maisu Meis Benoshel Rabbi Yossi B'Tzipori, one of the great Tanoim, lost his son in the city of Tzipori. V'nichnas lebeis hamedrash v'darash kol hayom kulo. And nevertheless, even though he was an Avel, he went into Beis Medrash and he taught Torah the entire day. And the assumption is that he taught the Torah that they were learning. He didn't choose, Dvar Maram Shabiyirmiyah or the Agadah of, of Churban Abayis and Git. He taught whatever they were up to according to their curriculum. Rabbi Baruch Chana, Isra Bey Milsa. Rabbi Baruch Chana had an Avelus. He lost one of his relatives. He thought he's not going to give it shir, his public shir. Amalei Rav Chanina, we were taught that if the people depend upon you to teach Torah and they want to receive your Torah transmission, you have to do so, even though you're an Ovel. Maybe you'll have to indicate your Avelus, as we'll soon see. But fundamentally, you're allowed to teach Torah and even required to teach Torah publicly. So once Rabbi Bar Chana was notified and appraised to the fact that he is obligated to teach Torah to Rabbi, even though he's an Avel, he thought it would be a matter of teaching Torah the exact way that he would have taught the Torah had he not been an Avel. And therefore, he wanted to set up an Amora. Right back in the day, they used to have a person who was like a foghorn, he's like a microphone. The Rebbe would whisper the shir into his ear and he would belt it out. He'd raise his voice. So that's exactly what Rav Bar Chana thought he would do. Amalei. Rav said to him, Tanya, and that far we're not going to go. To set up a full-fledged transmission of the Torah during your Avelus, that far we're not going to go. We're going to say, Adkan, you want to teach Torah to the people directly and raise your voice and project your voice, that's fine. But if you want to do it through an Amora, that's already prohibited. I mean, we see from this Gemara that teaching Torah through an Amora, which is called a Turgamon, is something that adds an entirely new dimension to the Talmud Torah process. It's not just teaching. It's literally, that's the way the Masorah was. So like Moshe Rabbeinu heard the Torah from Hashem, passed it on to the people of Israel. Moshe himself was a Meturgim. And he played the role of an Amor to convey the words of Hashem to Bnei Yisrael. And that's the way Torah has to be transmitted. So there's got to be an indication here that you're teaching Torah, yes, but not in the normal way of public transmission of the Torah. To give over the Torah to the next generation, which was done through an Amorah. And at this point, Rabbi Bar Chana is confused. He's saying, look, I can't teach Torah through an Amorah, through a Meturgon. I have to teach directly. I don't know if I can do that. Can I actually achieve this goal? Is there any way of having your cake and eat it? That's what the Gemara is asking. Can you change the way you're transmitting Torah, but at the same time have an Amorah who will project your voice? And the Gemara says, Ki hadid Tanya. This is the way we're going to solve the problem. Maisa umeis benosha Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, v'nichnas lebeis hamedrash, v'nichnas Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya v'yoshev b'tzilo. So here's the scene. Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai lost a son that comes into the Beis Medrash, and one of the Gedolim of that generation, Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya, comes in and sits down next to him. Lochash hu, and Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai whispers the Torah Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya to the ears of Rabbi Chananya. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya l'turgum. And then Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya would pass on and transmit the Torah that he had heard from Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai to the Meturgamon, and the Meturgamon would project his voice. Turgamon is Shmiel Rav. So we see that the prohibition here of an Avel teaching Torah through a Meturgamon only applies when it goes directly from the Rebbe to the ears of the Meturgamon. That's already the Tzuras Mesiras HaTorah, and that's prohibited during an Avel. But if the person who speaks to the Meturgamon is not an Avel, in this case Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya is not an Avel, then the Avel is allowed to transmit the Torah to Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya because he's not giving it directly to the Meturgamon, and then the Meturgamon is going to pass it on when he hears it from Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya. So we need that middleman. We learned in the Brisa, Avel shlosha yomim arishonim Okay, now the sugi that we're about to embark upon is, I would give it a title, how to break down the tshuva into two parts. What do I mean? There's Avelus Chamura, which is the most severe with the most harsh, demanding requirements and restrictions. And then there's a little bit of a hakola in the Avelus. So drop lower down. And we're going to have a number of possibilities. One possibility is to say that the real Avelus Chamura, which we call Merirus, that's the first day. Another Mandiyama is going to say, no, it extends 2 days. And a third Mandiyama is going to say 3 days. Now we're holding now by this sheet of 3 days. So the first 3 days of Avelus, they are very severe, very intense. And also Aniach Tefillin. Tefillin somehow reflects on the glory of a man. And now he's in the most profound state of Avelus, the first 3 days. And his situation is antithetical to Avelus. It's almost as if, antithetical to Tefillin. It's almost as if Tefillin is Pe'er and Avelus is Nivul. And you can't put Pe'er on the body that's Menuval. But Mishlishi V'yelech, Ushlishi B'chlal, Mutal Aniach Tefillin. Now, the Braisa adds another point, that the third day of Avelus itself can be divided into two parts. The first part of the third day of Avelus belongs to the first 3 days, and there's no room for Anochas Tefillin. But once he began the third day of Avelus with an Isa Tefillin, and he deliberately omitted donning his tefillin, then the second half of Yom HaShlishi already belongs to the balance of the Avelus of the last 4 days of Avelus. He writes, by refraining from wearing tefillin for a few moments of the third day, he completes the obligation to refrain from tefillin for the 3-day period of time, and this is a reflection of Mitzvah Hayom Kikulo. So it's really fascinating that part of the Avelus, which is Shevi Altaseh, is really a kiyum of Avelus, meaning we understood that the Avel is enjoined from bathing and anointing himself. That means that they're Isuri Avel, but those aren't Kiyume Avel. Maybe Atifas Arash and Kriyas Amita, that's already a Kiyum Avel. But now we're saying that avoiding tefillin, so to speak, in other words, by leaving out tefillin, that itself is a Kiyum. He's fulfilling his obligation of Avelus. But with regard to that Kiyum of Avelus, of not donning tefillin, on day 3, we're going to apply the principle of Mitzvah Yom Kippur. And now we have a new halacha called Panim Chadoshos. Bimbo Panim Chadoshos Eino Choletz. Now here we have to add the word afilu, because what we're going to see soon is that Panim Chadoshos is a mechayev. It generates a chiyuv of chalitza satzvah. Again, we have to know why, but that's called Panim Chadoshos. And the chiddush here in this brisa is that there's no din of Panim Chadoshos to generate a chiyuv chalitzas tefillin once he fulfilled that day 3 through Mitzvah Yom Kikulo, and from the balance of day 3 through the balance of the Shiva, there's no din of Panim Chadoshos choletz. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer, if he wore tefillin on the day 1 of his Avelus and day 2 of the Avelus, then certainly when the Avel comes in, when the Panim Chadoshos comes in, he would have to take off his tefillin. And in fact, Rabbi Eliezer holds that until day 3, he's not supposed to be putting on his tefillin. But let's say he put on his tefillin, it would be a din of chalitzas tefillin. So it's not enough that he does the ma'aseh nacha, which is prohibited. More than that, even shei gufo ma'uter b'tefillin, that's also forbidden. during Avelus. Rabbi Yeshua Omer Avel Shnei Yom Rishonim Aslan Tefillin. It's not 3 days, but rather 2 days. And therefore, Misheni V'Sheni B'Chlal Mutal Aniyat Tefillin. From the second day, and even on the second day, because again, the second day of Rabbi Yeshua is like the third day of Rabbi Eliezer, and we're going to apply the principle of Mitzvah Yom Kikula. And once again, in Bo Panim Chadashos, here it's in Bo Panim Chadashos Choletz. And Rashi says we're talking about day 2. So on day 2, he applied Mitzvah Yom Kikulo in the morning, and then in the afternoon or late in the morning, he puts on his tefillin. But now Panim Chadashos comes in, and that's Machayev Chalitza. So if we're dealing with day 3, for example, according to Rabbi Eliezer, then there's no din that Panim Chadashos generates a Chiyuv Chalitza. But if we're talking about day 2, according to Rabbi Yeshua, then on day 2, Panim Chadashos Machayev Chalitza. He writes here, based on Rashi, that although on day 2 he's allowed to put on tefillin, but nevertheless, Panim Chadashos is Machayev Chalitza, because these Panim Chadashos people might think that it's the first day of Avelus. They don't know whether it's day 1 or day 2, and they're going to come to the conclusion that you're allowed to wear tefillin on day 1 of Avelus. I guess in the case of Rabbi Eliezer, where it's 3 days, nobody's gonna make that much of a mistake. But if it's only day 2, they might think it's day 1. If it's day 3, they're not going to think it's day 1. But I'll be honest with you, I suspect that this din of Panim Chadashos and the requirement of Chalitza goes way beyond just this chashash that maybe the person coming in will mistakenly think it's the first day of Avelus. Why is he wearing tefillin on the first day of Avelus? I don't believe so. I think it's a din in Chalitza. And somehow Panim Chadashos creates a new Avelus. And the kiyum of Avelus is Chalitzas tefillin. Like, for example, I'm just thinking out loud, if a person would never find out about his loss as he's wearing tefillin, I think he would have to take off his tefillin. And the chalitzas at tefillin, if there was a bracha on Avelus, he would make the bracha. So I'm suggesting that chalitzas tefillin for an Avel is a kiyum. It's part of the Avelus, fulfillment of the Avelus. And once there's Panim Chadashos, that creates a brand new entity or enterprise of Avelus, and the kiyum of Chalitza is going to be implemented. Amar Rav Eina, my time at the Rabbi Yeshua. Why does Rabbi Yeshua allow you to wear tefillin on the second day? Implying that the intensity of Avelus, what we call the Avelus Chamura, is only on the first day. And the answer is the Siv, because the Pasuk says in Amos, Vachrisa Yom Mar. Wait, does it say Kiyomar? I think it says Kiyomar. Am I right? So it's like a bitter day. So the fact that it's in the singular, Yom Mar is one Yom. It means the first day. Once we get to the second day, there's already a little bit more of Hakala with a Kuf Hakala in the Avelus, such that now we can apply Mitzvah Yom Kikulo and allow him to wear tefillin in the second half of that second day. So the Chaf HaDimyon here of Ki Yomar might be hinting at day 2, which has Mitzvah Yom Kikulo, and that's also like the Yomar. But really, there's only one Yomar. So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Oh, wait a second. I see. I'm sorry. I backtrack a little. We skip. Omar of Masna. My time at Rabbi Eliezer. Why does Rabbi Eliezer say that Avelus goes the real chumrah de kavel is to generate an East tefillah goes even to the second day, and then we spill it over to the beginning of the third day, because the chsiv, with regard to the avelus of Moshe Rabbeinu, vayitru yemei bechi Evel Mochem. The word Yemei is in plural, and Ein Ribui Ella Miyad Ribui Shnayim. So it must be 2 days, and spilling over to the third day. Rabbi Yeshua, Nami Aksiv Vayitmu Yemei, etc. So we see that Avelis Chamura that generates an Isa Tefillin applies 2 days minimum. It says Yemei. Amalecha Shiny Moshe the Takif Evlin. With regard to the loss of Moshe Rabbeinu, they went further than the strict requirement, and they considered 2 days to be intense avelus. It's sort of similar to what we said about David HaMelech, that maybe he went further than Kfiyas Amida or Amida and Eov, etc., etc. So it seems that there's a kiyum avelus beyond the chiyuv avelus. There's a chiyuv avelus, and then there's an additional kiyum avelus. For Rabbi Eliezer, Nami Aksiv Achrisu B'Yom Kiyom Mar means 1 day. Ika Mirara Chad Yom. I don't deny that the main bitterness is for that day. And what is that day? That day is either the day of Kfura or it's the day of Misa and Kfura. Omar Ula Halacha Rabbi Eliezer B'Chalitza, Halacha Rabbi Yeshua B'Hanocha. So we're going to accept the view of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to Chalitza, which means that there's no halacha of Chalitza in Panim Chadashos, but halacha Rabbi Yeshua B'Hanocha, meaning that he's allowed to wear his tefillin, put on his tefillin on the second day of Shiva, after Miksayom Kikulo, because Kiyom Achritza Kiyom Ma. Now, it seems to me that there's something that fell here between the cracks in the statement of Ul. Because he seems to be saying that halacha Rabbi Eliezer b'chalitza, what does that mean? Does that mean that we completely reject the halacha of chalitza? I don't understand, because he just finished saying halacha Rabbi Yeshua b'Hanocha. And Rabbi Yeshua certainly had a requirement of chalitza. Maybe this is the Gemara's suffix. So you telling me that Ula paskin like Rabbi Yeshua, and he completely rejected the halacha, the requirement of chalitza, panim chadashos, which seems to be implicit in the phrase halacha Rabbi Eliezer b'chalitza. Now, if in one side of the Gemara's suffix there is a requirement of chalitza satfilin, then l'chora that should apply on day number 2 of Shiva, according to Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua holds that the first day of Avelis is certainly also b'anochas tefillin. So when we talk about chalitza, then we're talking about a possibility of allowing him to put on the tefillin, but requiring him to take off the tefillin in the presence of Panim Kadoshos. And that's going to be applicable on the second day. What about the third day? Oh, let's just see what he writes over here. He says, Rabbi Lazar paskin that there's no din of chalitza for Panim Kadoshos from day 3 and on. But if Ula is paskening like Rabbi Eliezer, then it means that just like Rabbi Eliezer said that there's no din of chalitza in Panim Chadashos, somebody out there? Okay. That in the, once once we pass the intense days of Shiva, which according to Rabbi Eliezer are the first 3 days of Shiva, then there's no longer din of chalitza b'panim chadashos. He says here, one does not have to remove one's tefillin for a new arrival from the 3rd day of Shiva. Now, according to Ula, you're allowed to put on tefillin from day number 2. And now what we're saying is that on day number 2, there would not be a din of chalitza sat tefillin. It seems that Ula does accept the principle of chalitza tefillin b'panim chadashos. And that should apply from day 2 and on. He says this ruling could not apply from day 3 and on, because Ula already paskin like Rabbi Eliezer that on day 3 there is no din of chalitzas tefillin. So therefore, this ruling should apply on the 2nd day of chalitzas tefillin, and there's no requirement of chalitzas tefillin even in Panim Chadashos from the 3rd day and on. It's really interesting. Mea pa'amim, every time somebody new comes in, you have to take off your tefillin and put it on again. Well, what is that? A kashash that he thinks it's day number 1? I don't know. Doesn't sound like that to me. Tanya Nami Yochi to the Brisa Yehuda ben Tema Omer Cholei to Meniach Afilu Mea pa'amim Rav Amar Kaven Sheiniach Shuven Choleitz. If you're allowing him to put on tefillin on day number 2 because you're paskening like Rabbi Yeshua, then once you're allowing him to wear the tefillin and put on the tefillin, he's not chayav to take off the tefillin for panim chadashos. So the Gemara asks a steer of a Rava who diyamar alocha kitana tidan diyamar shlosha. Rava himself paskins that the intense, what we call avelis chamura, is 3 days of shiva, which would mean that he's not allowed to wear tefillin. Not on the 1st day, not on the 2nd day, and not even at the beginning of the 3rd day. So how could Rava say that there's no requirement of chalitzas tefillin? It would seem that since Rava passing like the Tana of our Mishnah requires 3 days, then there should be a din of chalitzas tefillin at least on day 3 for sure, or possibly even on day 2. And yet Rava says, and here we turn to Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis.